So, 17 Uhr haben wir es, 5 o'clock. Wir haben jetzt sozusagen noch ein bisschen Luft, bis sich dann langsam das Publikum dazu schaltet. Ich darf also schon mal begrüßen zum heutigen Webinar. Ich mache das jetzt mal gerade auf Deutsch, weil ich jetzt hier gerade noch kein internationales Publikum sehe. Auch wenn wir das Webinar für Englisch angekündigt haben, aber jetzt, solange das noch hier in der Familie ist, so, jetzt Verbindung wurde erkannt. Jetzt muss ich mal schauen, ob ich hier verbunden bin. Jawohl. So, ich hoffe, es können mich alle hören.
Ja.
Und ja, genau. Hermann, man hört mich, oder? Genau.
Ja, klar und deutlich.
Sehr schön. Wie gesagt, wir haben einiges an Anmeldungen bekommen und Rückmeldungen im Interesse zu diesem Webinar heute zum Thema Hardware-Trojaner. Jetzt warten wir mal noch ein paar Sekunden, bis die Leute Gelegenheit haben, sich einzuwählen. Und dann legen wir auch gleich los. Jetzt müssen wir mal gucken, dass ich hier noch mal kurz was parallel mache. Also. Das fangen wir nämlich an. So. Dann schauen wir mal, ob das klappt. Gut, also ich würde sagen, wir fangen an. Warm welcome to our speakers today. We have two security experts. So, ich muss mich mal kurz vielleicht sichtbar machen, damit man mich auch irgendwie da. Die zwei Bildschirme haben wir gerade hier so ein bisschen so. Jetzt. Yeah, two security experts today with us from Technical University Munich. The idea for this talk came actually from Paul Karrer from Arrow and Professor Sigl. I'm sure you all know, one of the leading security experts on hardware security and information security. And from his group, we have today two speakers. We have Johanna Baehr and Alexander Hepp, who will dive into the topic of hardware security today with us. And their headline is How to Train Your Hardware Trojan Detector, Reverse Engineering into an Underrated Threat. Background of their work is that within their research, a security chip was designed, already equipped with post-quantum cryptographic functions, and the very question of how hardware Trojans on chip level are actually be inserted already in the design or during manufacturing at the chip foundries. So that was a side effect of that research, or is still under investigation. And so we thought that this talk would be of great interest to our audience and to many security experts who are dealing with these issues. And in an ever more connected world with ever more connected devices, machines, and equipment and systems, of course, hardware Trojans or malware that is designed to be already embedded somehow in those deepest hardware components is, of course, a line of risk that needs to be observed and understood. So I would like to welcome Alexander and Johanna. And thank you for joining and making yourselves available. And yes, I'll give you the floor. We will listen to your talk, and then we have time for the audience to give questions and we get into a little bit of a Q&A. Thank you so much, and I'll give you the floor. Thank you.
And now I'm unmuted. Okay, so thank you for the warm welcome. And you should now see my slides, and we can actually start. So we are, as Mr. Möhring already said, two security experts closely related to hardware security, in speciality to the reverse engineering. And that's also why our topic has the term reverse engineering into it. And this is something that will guide us through our talk today. What do we want to do today? We will look at why are hardware Trojans a threat in the current security world. Where do hardware Trojans actually come from in the silicon supply chain, and what to do about them? We will look upon the classical hardware Trojan countermeasures, look at the reverse engineering countermeasures to hardware Trojans, because they are of most importance, not only for us, but also for actually detecting the Trojans. And finally, we will also look at a case study that we developed at the chair. So for motivation, hardware security is of an increasing and ever-increasing importance today, as we have silicon hardware basically everywhere where security is important. We have embedded devices that make sure flights arrive at their locations. We have healthcare systems like pacemakers, but also like ventilators now we have learned are very important medical devices. And all these devices, also something like an iPhone, so a mobile phone, secure smart card, all these devices are connected today in a world of IoT devices. And in these interconnection, there also lies the threat of an attack. And this attack need not only be in software. This is the typical attack on connected devices we see every day in the security news, but also there is the threat of hardware attacks that are deeply inserted into our devices and are hard to countermeasure, as we will see. Another great motivation for investigating hardware Trojans is the current state of IC production, so integrated circuit production, ASIC production. And this is the global supply chain that today is used to source ICs for products that have some kind of electronics inside. For example, this is the supply chain of a mobile phone. This is exactly the supply chain of the Fairphone 2 depicted here. And we can see that, okay, there are some like resources that like gold, which will probably not have some connection with hardware security, but a lot of components come from the US, come from China, are assembled there, and then delivered to the customers, for example, in Europe. And we see that there are many, many parties involved in such a product, such a device, as a mobile phone. There are many, many chips in such a phone. And we can see that controlling this difficult and complex supply chain in a holistic manner to actually ensure that there is no malicious party involved can only be a very, very hard thing to achieve. Now for the Trojans. What are hardware Trojans and where do we find them? As an introduction, I have brought to you the actual case study that we developed at our chair. And I ask for you the question, can you spot the Trojans in this hardware design, in this ASIC design that we taped out? Just as an orientation, on the top left corner, we have some, and bottom left corner, we have some memories. Here on the right side is the chip logic, so the standard cells that make up the Boolean function of the circuit. And the Trojans now are here. They are these small, now colored dots that create the malicious functionality. In this case, we have 4 Trojans in this design. And as you can see, they only make up a very, very small part of such an IC. Yeah, the majority of an IC is still related to its original functionality. And this makes hardware Trojan detection especially hard. So what are hardware Trojans? Hardware Trojans are malicious and deliberately stealthy modifications made to an electronic device. In our case, we always look at ICs. You can also, as we can see later, look at hardware Trojans like on the PCB level. But in our case, we want to have a closer look at the IC level of hardware Trojan design. And what is now interesting about this definition that comes from a well-known work about hardware Trojan taxonomy is that it has 3 interesting parts in it. We have the maliciousness and the stealthiness in this quotation. We have maliciousness as it has to do something bad to our circuit. It has to change the functionality that is actually in our design. It has to be stealthy because else it's easily detected. And the third part, which is not so often looked at, is the actual modification that we have in the definition of hardware Trojans. A hardware Trojan should modify something. Yeah, a hardware Trojan can only exist if there is some derivation from what is actually intended to sit on the device. And as we can see later, the former 2 parts of the definition are like the more used parts of the definition for actually countermeasuring hardware Trojans, while the modification part that we have here is the interesting part for us because that's what we can tackle with reverse engineering. So we have already seen a case study about hardware Trojans. How do they look like? And now the question is, what can they do? Such hardware Trojans have been put into a taxonomy, and I will only shortly discuss this, but what you can already see is that we can categorize hardware Trojans by their different insertion phases. So where in the design phase, where in the silicon supply chain is the hardware Trojan inserted? What does it need as like something like knowledge about the circuit? Does it have to have system level knowledge about the whole system? Is it enough to look at the register transfer level code to insert this Trojan? Or is it even inserted at the physical level and only changes, for example, width of wires in our IC? We can have a look at the different activation mechanisms because sometimes it makes sense that a Trojan is always active. Sometimes it makes sense that it is triggered, so it activates on a specific trigger input. And this can be, for example, internal or external. And of course, hardware Trojans can have lots of different effects. For example, it can change the functionality of the device. It can downgrade the functionality, for example, downgrade the security level. It can leak data from the device or just do a denial of service of the device. And of course, hardware Trojans can sit in different locations. We will later already see that there are many, many different locations where we can put hardware Trojans. And some of them are more easy to detect. Some of them are harder to detect. Now for an example, where in this taxonomy does our case study hardware Trojans lie? And I have brought with me one example. This is the leaking hardware Trojan. So we created a hardware Trojan that leaks data from the device. And this hardware Trojan in the concrete example leaks through a covered power side channel. So it draws different amounts of power depending on the secret that should be leaked. And this hardware Trojan would be inserted somewhere in the specification or in the design phase. It is probably too late to insert it in the fabrication phase. We insert it at different abstraction level. It depends a bit, but in my concrete case, I inserted it at the register transfer level. It is internally triggered because it relies on a condition in the execution of the software code to actually activate, leaks then data, and sits like in the middle of processor and I/O in this case. Now, as we have seen, hardware Trojans are quite versatile, and as versatile as hardware Trojans are the locations where such hardware Trojans would be inserted into our silicon supply chain. This is the typical silicon supply chain that is today a very standard way of manufacturing a chip. We have some IP that goes into our design. We have an in-house design, so something that we actually designed. Then perform RTL verification and logic synthesis. This means our Boolean function that we describe as a functionality. So what should the chip do is now translated into like logic gates, Boolean functions that actually perform what we intended. We have then a gate level netlist, which is then physically synthesized, so mapped into the space of our silicon IC, mapped into the square that we have for our as our silicon, and the wires and interconnects need to have the correct length and so on and so forth. So we arrive at layout data. We verify that this layout data is correct, give the data to the foundry, get back a chip that we can test, that we can package, and finally arrive at a packaged IC that we can use for any application that we want to. Now, in this silicon supply chain, we typically can say, or the typically assumption is that we have a good part and a bad part. Yeah, we have like the front part, the front end, which is typically trusted, and we have the back end, which is typically untrusted. The unfortunate thing at this location is that this cannot be regarded as the true or the final answer to this question. So it is not enough to just check for hardware Trojan insertion at this back end here, but we have also got to have a look at the front end for hardware Trojan insertion. Because, as we can now see, we have so many different threads of hardware Trojan insertion. We have the hardware Trojan insertion at the foundry. This is the classic hardware Trojan insertion. We have a malicious foundry that somehow tries to know from the data the foundry gets what our design actually performs. Then it tries to insert the hardware Trojans at the correct location. Unfortunately, we could also have a hardware Trojan designer sitting in the backend. So before the foundry, and for example, it receives the gate level netlist. This gate level netlist will typically have much more information than what the foundry gets. The foundry gets just some vector data about what should be fabricated. The backend designer typically gets information about what do the signals do. Sometimes there are signal names and cell names. Sometimes there is even modularization. So the backend designer can have a very, very good look at what the design actually performs, and so has much more information about how to insert those hardware Trojans. We also have the case of the internal hardware Trojan designer. The designer sits now in our company. We have, for example, a spy from a foreign country. We have some spy from our own country, as we learned. The NSA, for example, also was invested in insertion of backdoors in their home country, in the US. And so the internal hardware Trojan designer should also be to our concern. Furthermore, of course, also in the inputs that we use, in the IPs that we use, hardware Trojans could exist. We could use an IP from an untrusted party or even from a trusted party, but again, some backdoor was inserted. And as I already said, somehow, I am not differentiating between backdoor, Trojan, and also not between bugs. Because in the end, basically, they all fulfill the hardware Trojan definition, namely some stealthy deliberately or deliberately stealthy modification, so derivation from the original functionality that has malicious and so a problematic effect on our device. And so it doesn't make any difference if we have a backdoor, so something that is inserted by an security agency or a bug inserted by a flaw in the programming of the device, or in the classic Trojan, like a foreigner inserting something into our device to circumvent the security. Okay, there are many, many locations for hardware Trojan insertion we have seen. There are many, many locations where this could have happened in the reality, but actually there are only a few cases where there's reports about actual hardware Trojans being inserted into a design or a device. There is the well-known case of the big hack that Bloomberg presented. This was in 2018. And they presented a case of server boards, so Supermicro server boards, having an additional device, small IC sitting on the PCB that leaked data, or it infiltrated the boot of the server and so could perform a remote code execution. Unfortunately, there was no good report about it. We could not have a look at what actually happened there. There were a lot of discussions about it. The actual manufacturers denied that there was such a Trojan inside their devices, and also the users strongly denied that there were such modifications to their devices. So it is not well known if this is actually the case. The second example I have brought, this is an article from 2008 from the Spectrum magazine. And there they claim that a failure of a Syrian radar system could be accounted to a hardware Trojan, to the insertion of a kill switch that the attacker there could have activated so that the radar system doesn't detect the approaching fighters. Unfortunately, we don't know. We don't know any actual account, any detailed report on the existence of hardware Trojans. This could be because they are very hard to insert. This could also be because if such a case would come up, the respective agencies would have a strong guard on the information that goes out. And as we don't know, we shouldn't underestimate the risk, and we shouldn't underestimate what is actually out there. And so the countermeasures are of an even greater importance. So the question is, what now in the world can we do about the hardware Trojans? In the scientific literature, there have been a lot of different possibilities for hardware Trojan insertion. We have heuristics-based methods, so we can identify locations of Trojan insertion. We can identify locations which are seldomly used, and so are good locations to put something into that should seldomly activate. We could, the more general, look at things that look Trojan-like, but this is always a cat and mouse game between the heuristics inventors and the heuristics defeaters. And as always with heuristics, we might arrive at a huge number of false positives. What we can also do is something like logical code analysis. We can compare with the golden model. We can compare with some formal circuit specification, but this gets quickly very complex. And also such a golden model is needed. In the case of set solving, this might be possible for small designs, but for large designs, set solving also becomes infeasible, and a golden model that is perfect is hard to achieve. This is the same for a formal circuit verification specification. What can we also do pre-silicon? So before we put our silicon to the foundry, we can also perform reverse engineering at this location. That is what we want to talk about later. And if we perform reverse engineering, we can have a look at what is the functionality that we have in our current design. Is this something that shouldn't be there, or is this something we know already and that is fine? We have now seen the pre-silicon way of detecting hardware Trojans, so before we actually go to the foundry. And after we receive the product from the foundry, hardware Trojan detection gets even more complicated. But before we look at that, we want to have a look at our definition again. And we can see that some of these methods only take into account parts of this definition. Yeah. So for example, if we look at heuristics, we typically look for something stealthy or for something malicious. This is what we do when using heuristics to detect hardware Trojans. If we perform logical code analysis, we also look for the change in functionality. We look at the maliciousness of our hardware Trojan. And only with the reverse engineering, this is why this is of so great importance, only with reverse engineering we can look at all of this. We can also just look at the modification, for example, just look at the design, look what we have there, and have a look if this is actually modified or if this is as it should be. Now for the post-silicon, so after going to the foundry, we can perform only very high-level measures. We can, for example, perform a side channel analysis. We can verify power, path delay, EM, thermal activity. There have been a lot of papers, and check if the design performs as our golden model does. So either by simulation, or we assume that we have some devices that are coming out of the foundry without Trojans and some that come out of the foundry with Trojans. And so we can compare something there and see if the side channel activity of our device, so of the power, of the path delays, and so on, is different from what we intended. Of course, this needs the Trojan to be somehow active, somehow influencing the side channel activity at all, because else we cannot see the Trojan in the side channels. This requires something to compare against. And of course, we can always design our hardware Trojan so that the side channel activity is as small as possible. Of course, what is typically done against hardware Trojans, this is what we anyhow do when we fabricate chips. We want to see if our chip is functioning properly, so we verify against test patterns. If we want to find hardware Trojans with functional testing, we would have to activate the Trojan. We have to actually make so that the Trojan changes the functionality, because only then we can detect it. And this is again a cat and mouse game. This again means hardware Trojans are designed so they don't activate, and with functional testing we try to find it anyhow. And again, reverse engineering can come to a rescue, because we can again detect stealthiness, maliciousness, and modification here. The last point of prevention is the so-called design for trust. We can try to design our device so that it is either hard to insert hardware Trojans. This is the prevention part that we will have a look at later. We can insert something like runtime detection. So for example, the change in behavior is detected as soon as it happens. Or we can also do formal verification or logical assurance upfront. So we can have like a chain of assurance that we know, okay, everything in our silicon chain is actually happening as it should. As we saw, reverse engineering is a good method to detect hardware Trojans, and this is why we want to have a closer look at what reverse engineering is actually, and that is where my colleague Johanna Baehr will take over. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you, Alex. So where Alex is a little bit on the hardware Trojan side, I do more of the reverse engineering side. Alex, you'll, I guess, reshare the screen. Thanks so much. So you've probably all heard of how to reverse engineering. What is the idea of reverse engineering? We're actually analyzing an existing system. We're trying to extract some kind of knowledge regarding either the structure or maybe the state of transitions or the behavior of the system. And usually we might want to do something like clone the system. So there's a very general example that we have, which you may have maybe heard of, that someone went ahead and designed a very nice airplane, and someone else kind of got a hold of that airplane and redesigned that and created exactly the same airplane, or at least something very similar, and basically didn't have to spend any money on doing the whole designing part of this. We, of course, don't do reverse engineering of airplanes, so we do reverse engineering of chips. And here it's a little bit different. So we have a couple more steps. We have to do something like delayering, because our ICs usually have a couple of different layers. So it can be, so usually there's a polysilicon layer, and there's usually 4 to 10 different metal layers that you can have in there. Once we figured out what the layers are, we have to image the whole entire chip. We have to stitch together the pictures. We have to do some kind of gate extraction. And finally, at the end, we have to understand what all these gates actually mean together. And I'll go through these steps a little bit more in detail about how they work, just to give you an understanding of how, maybe I don't want to say difficult it is, but how much of an effort it is to actually do this. So I'll start off with the delayering. Generally, what we have to do is first we have to get our IC out of the package. So that's already the first part. We can use chemicals, or we can grind down the package to remove it. And then we have to know where do we actually have to cut the delayer. So we usually do a cross-section of the die and figure out, how many layers are there actually on this die. Have we got 6 metal layers, or have we got 10? How many times are we going to have to grind down each single layer? Once we figure that out, so let's say we maybe have 6 different layers. On the picture you can see here, I think that's 7 or 8. Right at the bottom you can see the polysilicon layer, and then above that you can see each metal layer. So if you come across something like that, you would say, okay, I obviously need to take off first the first layer, take a picture of each of that, and then go on to the second, third, fourth, fifth, until you finally get to the polysilicon layer. We can remove those for very large text sizes, for example, by polishing. When we get to very small nanometer sizes, we have to do things like chemical etching or ion etching to actually get very clear and plain removal of each layer, so we can see the layer below. So that's already pretty difficult to do when we get to really small chips. So we're talking really nanometer size here, and it becomes very much a physics problem. Next step we have to do, once we have sort of delayered one layer, is we have to image the chip. So we usually use a scanning electron microscope or X-ray, and depending on the size of the chip for each layer, generally we get a couple of thousand pictures per each layer. We have to then figure out how these pictures all work together, how we're aligning them to get one clear, fairly big image for each layer. And then we have to synchronize the layers vertically, so that basically we can be sure that they are really above each other. And you can see something of these pictures here. So these are all metal layers, and you can see the vias in white and sort of in black, where the metals are the metal is lying. So once we've managed to do this, we've managed to sort of get a fair few thousand pictures for each single layer, and then produce one final big picture. We have to go to the next step, which is our post-processing. So we have to basically figure out where are all our signals. We have to trace the signals, we have to identify contacts, and we have to reconstruct the standard cell library. I do have 2 pictures here for this. So the first picture you'll see basically where we first find the contacts, and then we have to trace our wires to find our signals, and obviously we have to do this in 3D as well. So we have to figure out in 3D above or across all the layers where our signals are, and then we have to reconstruct the standard cell library. So this is usually an image processing problem, where first we identify what kind of technology is being used, and then we go over and basically classify each structure we can see into one of the standard cells. So for example, an inverter cell, or an XOR cell, or maybe a memory cell. Of these, there can be a couple of 100,000. For a big chip, you get a couple of million. So you end up getting a fair few number of gates out of there. And finally, we kind of do some error checking. We make sure there's no floating gates which aren't connected. There's no unconnected nets. The inputs and outputs are all connected. And we kind of do some error checking. And that's kind of the easy part. So once we've done that, it becomes kind of more difficult, because we really have to try to figure out what's actually happening. So delayering to post-processing, we generally say, depending on the IC and depending on the tools you have standing around, it's either impossible or it takes around 2 weeks to 3 months. It can take longer if you've got a very small chip. And the outcome really is, a sea of gates netlist. So you have really connections between standard cells. And the question is now, what is this thing that you have created? How do I actually understand what is happening here? So for example, you might see something like this picture here, which is basically a graph view of an RSA. But if I don't tell you that, you probably wouldn't have been able to figure out that those dots and those connections are supposed to represent a cryptographic algorithm. And those are only a couple of hundred cells. So if you do that for 7 million, yeah, it's not so much fun. So we'll go to the next step of how we can actually figure out this kind of thing. And to do this high-level abstraction, what we're trying to do is to get from a gate-level netlist to something humanly understandable. So to some abstraction that a human is able to understand, whether that be this is a AES cryptographic accelerator with a RISC-V core, or something else which you can understand. That's kind of an open question, how we actually describe that, but generally something that a human is able to comprehend. And generally, we assume that the functionality can be gained through comparison with something known. So for example, we have all seen maybe an IES crypto core before, and we might compare what we have on our chip with that and say, is it alike? Is it not alike? If it's alike, maybe that's what it is. If we don't know the module, we tend to divide and conquer. So we try to break it into smaller parts until we figure out something that we do know. So for example, if you have a whole entire IC, probably you don't have that IC lying around, so you can't compare it, but you might break out something that looks like a cryptographic algorithm and then compare that part to all cryptographic algorithms you know. So we have kind of two main problems when we do high-level reverse engineering. We have to find potential submodules, potential things we can break out, and we then have to figure out what is the functionality. So what is this submodule? So step one, partition the thing and try to divide it. Part two, try to figure out the functionality of each single module you got. And if that doesn't work, you keep dividing until you do find something. So how does this work? The state of the art is kind of as follows. So when we're trying to figure out how to divide up our chip so we can understand it, first thing we generally can do is say, we'll try to figure out where the data is flowing. So we do some data path identification. And the assumption is here that with design, even if we have a sea of gates, some regularities remain. So you can imagine, for example, if you have a 32-bit multiplier. That is doing something fairly similar on 32 bits at the same time. So you will be able to group nodes which do the same things and carry out a word in 32 bits and say this is probably where data is going in and this is where the output of the multiplier is. So the data is going from point A and B to point X at the outside, and say that's where the data is flowing. And once you kind of do that for your whole entire chip and you figure out, where are my words of data actually going, you can figure out the data path and you can cut between sort of memory elements. So if you imagine you have your multiplier, you might figure out this is the beginning and this is the end, and I'll cut between that, and that would be my submodule. So that's one way of doing it. The other thing we can do is we can try to find some graph-based methods. So if you would go to the next slide. Oh, I do have an example here for this, but that's okay. I think we'll go on to the next method. The second method we have is basically graph-based, and here the assumption is that submodules are more interconnected. And if you imagine, for example, an IC, it will generally have some kind of bus, and it'll have, I'm going to say that very colloquially, bits hanging off the bus. So the bus will be connecting modules together. And in between the modules, there will be more connections than to other modules which are not connected to that module directly, but only via the bus. So if you were, for example, to look at that, you would find that there is a lot more connections within that module, and you can use that from a graph-based perspective and actually do something called clustering. So we can do natural cluster analysis and find potential submodules. An example here is a random walk algorithm. There's a few other ones we can use. Some of them work better, some of them work worse. And what we actually see at the bottom is a very parallel or highly parallelized AES, so it's got all of its 200 S boxes implemented in full. And when we cluster that, we are actually able to figure out which gates belong to each single one of these S boxes, which is very nice. Excuse me. We can also use layout optimization because generally modules will be placed sort of locally close to each other. Obviously, when you're designing, you don't want your signal to have to go from the bottom right of the chip to the top left. So if it's supposed to, you know, be doing the same functionality and be working together and be used very often, so you try to optimize in a way that the signal does not have to travel so far. And so we can also try to figure out how to use layout data in order to sort of make this circuit clustering a little bit stronger. So we can assume generally that we're able to cluster 90–95% of the chip in a good way. There's always going to be some interfaces which we have trouble with, some parts which we might have to do by hand or which might not work automatically, but generally this is where we get to. And we can do our second step. So we now have sort of divided up our design into bits, and we want to know what those bits do. And there's two methods here. The first one is formal, based on formal methods. So we assume here that you have a library somewhere of known things you've seen before. This could be cryptographic algorithms, could be very basic data manipulation, like, for example, multipliers, adders, subtractors, dividers, and so on. It could be ALUs, it could be different kind of interfaces, it could be bus structures, it could be FSMs. And you want to compare those to our potential unknown submodules, and we can try to prove functionality, or that the functionality is the same, so functional equality. And we can do that using a MITRE circuit, using satisfiability solving. So basically, we connect all the inputs of both modules of our unknown and our known module, and we connect both outputs, and we say, is it possible that these two things are, for any kind of input we put in there, the output is different? And if that's not possible, so for any input we put into both designs, if the output is always the same, then they must be functionally similar. And we can prove that very nicely using satisfiability solving. We do have some problems there, which is why we don't use this so much anymore. I don't want to go too deeply into why, but we do have a second method of doing it, which tends to be a little more fuzzy. And I basically call it a fuzzy method. Again, we assume that we have a library of known IP, and we have to define some structural and functional characteristics. And then we can basically compare the two things, so our known IP to our unknown IP, either visually using these characteristics or statistically or even machine learning. I do have a picture here for this. So for example, we've got 8 different designs here, and depending on what our design might look like, we might even be able to visually match it. So for example, you see at the middle top and the middle right, you have sort of these big balls of gates. These are actually two very similar things. And obviously doing this just visually is not enough. So we do use statistic or even machine learning approaches to make sure that they really are similar. This also has some issues. So this is actually not as easy as it sounds, but we tend to be able to identify most of what we see, and you probably already figure out the big problem that if this is something we've never seen, we might have some issues basically being able to identify it if it's not within our known IP. So one of the big problems of reverse engineering is if we encounter anything we haven't seen before, we really have to sort of either divide to a point where we do break it down to a point of we've seen everything, which is possible in hardware, or we have to get an external or some engineer who has to really do that part by hand. So for us, I think the most important part from the reverse engineering side is that it's fairly costly and lengthy to actually reverse engineer a whole entire chip. However, it does mean that we really are able to check that the chip contains what we're expecting it to contain. And while the reverse engineering, the high-level extraction, tends to have some issues, we've gotten fairly far into automating that, which I think is a huge improvement compared to 10 years ago. And I would like to pass back to Alex, who will talk some more about what we can do with all this and how the Trojan detection works with reverse engineering.
Yeah, so how does this now help us detecting hardware Trojans? When we look at reverse engineering, we can use now hardware Trojan detection with reverse engineering because we can now identify using reverse engineering what is in our design. So what functionality has been put in the concrete silicon or in the concrete like layout or logical description of our device. And of course, we, as I already said, we can also detect backdoors and bugs with this technique by just using the information we get from the reverse engineering to either identify known Trojans in a circuit. So basically, that's what Johanna already said. Now applied to the hardware Trojan case, we have a catalog, a library of hardware Trojans, and we try to find similarities between what is in our design with hardware Trojans that we have in our library. The possibility B is to identify everything else and then say, okay, I know now what is in the design, and dear engineer, dear security engineer, please have a look at this part of the design. This looks suspicious. I do not know what this is. And how does this look like? We have, again, the case of the RSA, and we have there this red parts at the bottom and at the top, which are inserted by the hardware Trojan. The rest of the RSA is, for example, multipliers on the both left and right side. And what we want to achieve now is something like this here. This is a result from a reverse engineering process applied to the circuit. And what we can see is that the cells that belong to the hardware Trojans are deeply red. So our reverse engineering and upon that machine learning process detected that these cells belong to the Trojan because they were looking like something it knows already. And the rest of the cells, they do look a bit like hardware Trojans because there are some small Trojans also in the library, which could be something like this here or maybe something like this in here. But in general, the machine learning is not so convinced that this is belonging to the hardware Trojan. Unfortunately, reverse engineering is also something that eases hardware Trojan insertion. So in the moment where we invent better methods to reverse engineer, we might also invent better methods to know more about the design and to design better hardware Trojans that fit better into the design that can have even more capabilities. And that's why we also want to countermeasure reverse engineering, so countermeasuring hardware Trojans. And this happens at the layout level. For example, we might want to use something like split manufacturing, where we manufacture only part of our chip in the foundry, which is untrusted, and part of the chip in a trusted foundry. And we assume that just by the things that are manufactured in the untrusted foundry, the foundry cannot know enough of the design to insert hardware Trojans. We could, for example, do cell camouflaging, so making cells harder to identify. We saw before this is a machine learning task, and we might make it harder to detect what a cell does look like. We might insert dummy cells that just make the whole process more complex, or we might use programmable standard cells, so something like an FPGA, like mini version of an FPGA, so that the identification of the Boolean function is not only a problem of identifying like visual specificities of our silicon layout, but also we would have to retrieve information how this cell is now concretely programmed. Also on the logic level, we can do things like logic locking and FSM obfuscation, which try to obfuscate the design, which try to make it harder for us reverse engineers to understand the design and to insert hardware Trojans. Of course, with all these measures, we also make it harder to detect hardware Trojans because we have a harder time separating the hardware Trojan part from the normal part of the design if we don't know even less about it. Unfortunately, such countermeasures against the concrete insertion of hardware Trojans are not an encryption of the device. We cannot encrypt our device because it should still perform what we intend it to do. We cannot just encrypt the IC completely, but we have to keep its functionality somewhere in there. And this means the question is always, can we hide enough to actually countermeasure our hardware Trojan insertion? to our rescue might come open source hardware, because when we can do open source hardware, when we can use open source hardware, we can build a chain of trust. A chain of trust that goes from the user space software via formal verification of the software code upon the instruction set architecture, then a formal verification on the RTL design. So comparison, is this instruction set architecture actually completely and without any additions implemented by the RTL? And then we compare with the synthesized gate level netlist. We compare with what is actually on our chip. And if we have done all these comparisons, all this chain of trust, we can then know, okay, our hardware is good. And if we have open source hardware, of course, we can crowdsource some of this assurance as well. Yeah, so we can crowdsource the checking of the user space code of the RTL and so on to make sure that our hardware is actually proven to be secure under all circumstances and hardware Trojan free. We have now seen a lot of methods to insert hardware Trojans and to detect hardware Trojans, but what of an effort is this actually in reality? And there I want to come back to my case study and about the hardware Trojan design in practice that I did and put to silicon. For our design, we had a RISC-V core, so one of those famous new instruction set implementations of the RISC-V. And this is a microcontroller core, so there's no memory management. It would not be able to run a complete operating system like Linux or something like this. It is more a microcontroller like an Arduino device, for example. In this core, I inserted 4 hardware Trojans that each have a different functionality and a different way or way of insertion, different knowledge level required. For example, we have the hardware loop Trojan that uses the specificity of the concrete design because it has a hardware loop controller. It can execute software loops in hardware. And we can now use this hardware loop controller, for example, if it is used in a cryptographic algorithm in malicious ways. If we break those hardware loops early, we might break the encryption or we might reduce the security level of the encryption. Something similar was done for a post-quantum cryptography accelerator. I infiltrated this with an hardware Trojan at the entity calculation, so number theoretic transform. That's a specific calculation necessary for post-quantum cryptography. And I inserted it so that the key of the encryption gets 0. And this is even not detectable by the person sitting on the other end of the communication channel. So we cannot, the communication partner cannot detect that the key was set to 0 because of the specific design of this encryption scheme. We can also leak things with our hardware Trojans. We have seen that before. I will have a look into this. And a very simple hardware Trojan that was just put in as an example, and as the easiest hardware Trojan we have there is a denial of service hardware Trojan, which just disables the circuit after a specific runtime if we activate it. So how would those hardware Trojans in reality look like? For example, we now look at the entity Trojan, the Trojan that changes the cryptographic key. And this is the core formula for Kyber encryption, for this encryption scheme, this post-quantum encryption scheme, and for the encryption used in this Kyber encryption. And in this concrete implementation or in this concrete encryption scheme, we see that there is an entity function used here, this entity inverse function. And this function has the nice effect that it is basically used as a key for putting data into the channel. So U and V is the data that is put into the communication channel, which is the encrypted data. And entity is basically the key for the data. The data is just here. If we now set this entity to 0, so it's a very simple Trojan. It just has to set like 32 bits of data to 0. And as soon as it does this, the key is 0. And when the key is 0, we just transmit the message across the channel. And the fortunate thing is that this encryption scheme allows the counterpart of the communication channel to just decrypt this as if nothing had happened, because something like the key is transmitted additionally to the actual message. So V is the message, and U is something like the key transmitted across the channel in a secure way. And the counterpart of the communication channel can just uses something like this key or this transport key to decrypt the message, and he can simply do so because we also modified the key here. So hardware Trojans can be very simple. We can just set something to 0 and have a very, very strong effect on the security of this device. We can try to make more sophisticated hardware Trojans. We can try to do something like hardware-software co-design for hardware Trojans. And in this case, I had a close look at the hardware loop, so this execution of software loops in hardware. And for this, we have some setup instruction, this LP count I instruction, which sets the number of loop iterations that actually the hardware should execute. And in this loop iteration setup assembly function, we have some unused bits. Unfortunately, neither the compiler nor the hardware actually checks for these bits. So we can just put some additional bits in here. We have, for example, here put the second bit to the value 1. So this is what we see here as well in the final opcode. And what happens now is that our hardware loop Trojan attaches to this bit, looks at this bit, and if this bit is 1, it should activate its malicious intent. It should disable this loop, basically only do 2 iterations. And so we can use a malicious software compiler, software which is very, very sophisticated. We can basically do anything in the software and can detect any complex cryptographic algorithm executed in software, and just tell the compiler that if it should detect something where the hardware loop should be set to 2 iterations, the compiler can just do so and change only 1 bit of the complete executable file. We very probably won't notice that there is a 2 here, even if we look at the disassembly. This is a very, very small change, and still the effect is enormous. In this case, I demonstrated this with decreased encryption security for another post-quantum encryption scheme. Finally, what we can also do is we can leak information. And in this concrete case, we had a leaking with ring oscillators. These ring oscillators have a short and a long loop, meaning that if we set the data bit to 1, we have the long loop and the ring oscillator oscillates more slowly. If we set the data bit to 0, the ring oscillator oscillates a bit more quickly. And we can, in this way, generate a different power consumption, because a quick oscillation draws more power than a short than a slow oscillation. And what we can do with it is leak arbitrary data from the memory of the chip with a very, very simple construction and a very, very hard to detect construction in the design. How does it look like? This is an actual measurement on the ASIC, and we can already see that this Trojan now messages something like SOS. So it's short, 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 long, 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 short, short, short. Yeah, there's some Trojan in our design, obviously. But of course, it is not restricted to the data 0x0A8EE2A, but we can leak arbitrary 32-bit data using this power side channel, and this is measurable quite easily from the outside. I didn't have to put a fancy setup there. It's a very, very simple setup to get information out of the design, and we could even have a look at this on the EM emanations, so what is coming out via electromagnetic radiation, and see the Trojan information there. So leaking data from a chip is also something that hardware Trojans can do, and also something that hardware Trojans easily can do, in specifically if they are assisted by software, as in this case study. So what are our takeaways? Hardware Trojans obviously endanger all the security principles. There is nothing that hardware Trojans cannot do. And And they also, unfortunately, occur at a lot of points in the supply chain. Yeah, there's a lot of locations where hardware Trojans could be inserted. There are even more that I explained before. And we also saw in our case study now that little capabilities, just changing some values, just having some ring oscillators, allow big threats to the security of our design. So what can we do about it? We can detect and prevent them. Unfortunately, detection and prevention is not yet fully automated. It depends on a lot of factors, and in the end, it's hard to guarantee that the detection and prevention methods, like the classical ones, actually work. And even for the reverse engineering detection and prevention, there is a good assurance that these methods work, but also, of course, there is no guarantee. What can we conclude from this? To defend against hardware Trojans, we need a defense in depth. It's not enough to just have one spot in our supply chain where we check for hardware Trojans. We should check basically at any location, at as much locations as we can, to detect the hardware Trojans as early and as reliable as possible. We should do a risk analysis. So where could hardware Trojans be inserted? Where is the risk of a hardware Trojan actually performing something evil? What is the possibility of a hardware Trojan? What can it do? How can it harm our design? And finally, we can think about open and verified design so that we crowdsource the security and have a trustable anchor for our secure devices by having an open information about the security properties. This is the end of our presentation. I thank you very much for your interest to the topic. I have some references here, and now we are open for questions.
Thank you so much, Johanna and Alexander, for this extensive talk on hardware security, practically in all details. Forward and reverse in all phases of engineering. Maybe the good news is I understand that open source hardware is part of a possible solution because of the transparency of the whole designs and implementations. So I like that part of your talk. Again, maybe you mentioned your case study and showed some examples where hardware Trojans could be inserted, but how realistic is it really that that designs are tempered and or even in the foundry manufacturing processes are somehow modified to really add these Trojans into the actual hardware? Is that requires a whole chain of complicity. I don't know, well organized. Otherwise, or what is your view?
I think, in my opinion, it's a thing worth analyzing. It's important to have a look at it, to check for your concrete device that you look at what risk level you are sitting. So I would assume, for example, for a consumer device that is not very probable to handle sensitive data, I think the risk is simply smaller. And the more you get into risky devices, the more probable, in my opinion, it is that hardware Trojans are actually inserted and that these complications that we saw are actually overcome for insertion. In my case study, I did not have that much of information. Basically, for some of the Trojans, I only need to have access to some signals. I only need to identify some parts of the device. I do not need to identify the complete functionality. I do not have to do the complete reverse engineering process. It is enough to know, for example, for simple denial of service Trojan, for simple Trojan which disables the chip, you basically only have to know what is the clock and where could I draw activation signals from that are not so easily detected. And that is all you need for hardware Trojan insertion, and this is even automatable. So
Okay.
And it must be noted at that point too that the foundry doesn't have to reverse engineer your chip from the ground up. They get the GDS2 data, they have the layout, and for them to extract netlist from that and to go higher level is not, as I said before, not something like 3 months. That's a couple of hours and days. And I think that's something that's very easily hidden within the time frame which the chip is actually at the foundry until you get it back. So I think it's doable. The question is whether.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is up to the risk assessment.
I would say,
We have some very faithful listeners today who are actually part experts because they are from the chip, secure chip industry as well. I don't know. Do we have questions from the audience? Helmut, Kai, I don't know. I know you're deeply into this security designs and mechanisms, and so if there's any question you have.
Yeah, I'm just a user. So, I'm interested in the topic, but I only do software. And since I try to build 100% secure systems, well,
it's an issue when the hardware is secure, right?
It's an issue for me.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the other thing, right? If software is insecure, you're getting a couple of thousand, couple of 100,000 people. If the hardware is insecure, you're hitting millions, if not more.
Yeah.
And it's also not patchable, the hardware, of course.
Yeah.
Next issue, yeah.
But then for you, basically, this assurance that the hardware is performing as it is intended would actually help. So basically, having a guarantee that the data sheet of your device is actually the true information about the device, then makes you or puts you into the position of actually implementing something secure, right?
Yeah, it would be that way, I think. But I'm using, well, mostly AMD or Intel processors, so it's a lot of work to do. And
yes,
well, I think you played around with the RISC-V, which is much smaller than an Intel CPU or something, and it's getting exponentially complex.
But this is also not something that you should be doing as an end user. This is the job of the foundry to guarantee this, and the foundry does have, like, I guarantee you, they have people who look into this and who are researching into this and to do this.
Yeah.
So it's not your job as a software engineer to make sure the hardware is secure. It's the other way around. Maybe it's your job as a software engineer to tell the people you buy your hardware from that you want to make sure that they made sure that it's secure, but you're not going to be the one doing it. There's a question in chat if there's a way to design software that does not trust the hardware. I think probably, but I'm not sure where you're going to get your root of trust from then. I mean, you have to have your root of trust somewhere in the hardware.
Yeah, somewhere has to be a root of trust. Somewhere. Yeah. So
I remember a paper about software, so using an unreliable device for secure computation. But I think this also depends somehow on what you want to achieve. For example, having an untrusted device which could potentially leak data, you won't be able to go around this in the end. Somewhere on your device, if you have, for example, a sensor somewhere in the field, and this should take sensitive data and send it to a server, then somewhere the sensitive data has to lie around in plain text. You won't achieve a secure end-to-end security in your device. If you have only something like a server which maybe only handles encrypted data and does never look at the plain text, then you might achieve handling of this encrypted data with an untrusted device. Yes, there is a paper about this, basically using something like homomorphic encryption for this.
Yeah.
But
it's very complex, and it's eating resources, and that's the other thing. Eating resources is always bad and it's expensive. And people want terabit networks these days, and so
maybe it's better to have something upfront to once invest the resources for the assurance there. Yeah.
I mean, the other option is obviously to manufacture in a way which no one has access to. I think this is one of the big issues, that we don't have the manufacturing capabilities in, for example, Europe or even in Germany to do this. And I think that's one of the big things which is happening now, that they're realizing, oh, wow, we probably should have done this 30 years ago, but let's start now. And that there's money being invested in manufacturing in Germany again for this issue.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, but it will take 25 years.
More, definitely. I don't think we're going to catch up
even
in
more.
5 years, 50. Yeah, definitely.
Mm.
There is so much knowledge which is gone.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
Apple. Yeah.
Apple is investing there. Yeah.
But we've outsourced so much knowledge, even like in manufacturing, like clean room stuff, to other places, that this is extremely difficult to catch up on that. If you want to be doing your 7 nanometers and stuff like that, no way you're doing that in Germany. Not in the next 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
We have a comment on homomorphic encryption, by the way, a topic that we treated a couple webinars before, which was already also offering some interesting perspectives on actually operating sensitive data on untrusted networks and devices. True, but one of our hardware experts here, Ulrich from G&D, also says that those keys could be compromised anyway by a Trojan that sits already on the hardware. Obviously, this is what you explained before.
Be more complex, though. It would be more complex to you would have to know that someone's going to be using this kind of encryption. So you can't put in a very simple hardware Trojan. You have to know beforehand what it's going to be used for. So.
In the blue eye picture of the remote person that is not part of the semiconductor industry, the image of sending the design of a semiconductor to the foundry in a protected and secure way, that it be produced at the foundry, you seem not to trust, or we seem to be a very blue-eyed, or how would you describe that position?
Alex, do you want to answer, or do you want me to answer this one?
You can do if you want.
Okay. Yeah. So I think we have seen some very scary software attacks in the last 10 years, and we would be stupid to ignore those and think that they won't be happening within the next 10 years on hardware. There's people who have the resources, and there's a lot of research going into this. I don't want to be the typical fearmonger. I don't think it's going to be something that's going to be affecting, the normal person. It's going to be something like Stuxnet. It's not going to be affecting you and me, except maybe by accident. But on a state actor level, this is going to be of interest. And eventually, of course, on a state actor level, that does come down to the general consumer. So it is something that should interest all of us. It's not something that we should be scared of individually, but on a whole is my general view of it.
Maybe that's a good conclusion for today's talk, that we should be attentive and aware, but then again, also see the dimension and of the problem or of the risk. And coming back to one of your advices here on this chart, actually, to really look at the risk analysis, the second from last point, to really understand what is to be gained and how much effort and how scalable. So I think that, and what other mechanisms could be also considered in design of preventing those Trojans to, at least to really scale up to the millions and billions of devices where the same chips will be used. So that would be maybe another field of research for your chair. And well, thank you so much for giving this talk. We have recorded it and we'll put it online so that people who did not have time today are able to listen to it. And it was a pleasure to have you and to get this little walk through the hardware landscape on the very core, on the semiconductor level. And yeah, I think we will continue next week with another talk also on the architecture of chip designs, following those attacks a couple of years ago on Intel architectures that you all know. And so the hardware and the very core of it will be still our topic, and shows the importance and relevance of it in an ever more connected Internet of Things. And yeah, thank you to the faithful listeners for joining today. And I'll say good night and good evening, and see you next week. Bye. Thank you.
Thanks also from our side. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.